functions and dependencies. All right, so before we start, I would love to ask, like, so far we've done so many things. We've um we've looked at the basics of Python, we've looked at the basics of fast API, how to handle path parameters, request parameters, and query parameters, how to send forms, JSON, how to work with files, and all of that. So before we proceed to the next stage of the class, that's today's topic, I would love to request for questions. Is there anything you are having difficulties understanding at this point? Is there anything you would love me to explain again? I think let me start with Uche. Uche, is there anything you've not understood so far that you would love an explanation? And MJ, I think this is the first time I'm seeing you in the class. Do you have, like, is there anything you don't really understand?
No, sir. It's not the first time. I changed it to mic.
Okay.
Just in case of the other mic.
It's all right. So Uche.
Okay, from my end, there's no question. At least based on everything you have taught, I know during the class there were some aspects that I didn't understand very well, but when I went online to check it out, everything was clear. Query parameters, path parameters, how to use files, like you taught us how to use create forms, the multi-path. I understand everything so far.
Okay, that's perfect. So, Dale, welcome to the class. Is there anything you like so far in the course? Is there anything you don't understand that you'd love further explanation? Dale?
That was I understood everything fine.
Okay, that's good to know. So today's class we'll be looking at, like I said earlier, dependencies and request middleware. So we are going to start with middleware. Right? We understand what middlewares are really in the context of fast API, and when we are done with middlewares, we will look at dependencies, what they are, why they are important, and the potential use cases. And that will be that for today's class. Then tomorrow's class will focus more on security, how to work with permissions, how to work with password hashing, how to handle JWT tokens, and the rest of that. So, as usual, we are going to create a folder for, I think, today's class. I think today's class 9, if I'm not mistaken. So we are going to create a folder for class 9, and we will put every code we need to write into that particular folder. Before I do that, let me commit my current changes to Git and push it to the class repo. All right, so that's that. Then I'm going to create a directory for class 9. So we do that, we make the class 9. Then I'm going to cd into that directory. Then currently the directory is empty. We are going to create a virtual environment where we install all the dependencies we are going to work with today. And after that, I'll create a server file that we'll be working with for today's class. So we are creating a virtual environment at the moment. All right, I think that's now we are going to activate the virtual environment. All right, it's activated. Next step is to install FastAPI along with all its dependencies. All right, I'll check that they've been successfully installed. So we do that with git freeze. Okay, we have all the packages we need to work with here. Okay, so let me clear this. I'm now going to open this directory with my VS Code. All right, so the very first thing we are going to do here is to create the server file that we'll be working with. And as usual, I want to call this file server.path. So I can do that with touch server.path. All right, and I will I'll then activate the virtual environment and we start. Okay. So I'm going to create a very simple endpoint that does basically nothing. It won't do anything important at this point because I just want to use it and demonstrate what middlewares are in FastAPI, what you really use it for, why it is important, and basically how it is done. All right. So we are going to create a very, very simple endpoint that does basically nothing. All right, so I will open the Zero file, and as usual, we are going to import FastAPI from the FastAPI package. Import FastAPI, and the next step is to instantiate the FastAPI class, and and then start creating our endpoint. So that will be app is equal to first return. Then I'm going to create an endpoint. I'm going to create an endpoint that takes a simple GET request and returns hello. Okay, GET sync function below. Takes no parameters and simply returns so I believe since we've done this so many times in this course, it doesn't really need explanation. What I've just written here doesn't really need explanation. We are basically putting a base route that accepts a GET request and returns hello world. Right, so I'm going to start the server. Rubicon server up, and I want it to load whenever we have a change. So let's test this with our postman, so with our insomnia. All right, so I'm going to send a simple GET request down there and see what happens. All right, so we have a response called data hello. Okay, so with this, we are ready to get to the interesting part. That's middlewares. Right, but I would love to pause for questions. Like, is there anything here you don't understand? Any questions so far? You can drop it in the chat, and I'll be happy to attend to that before we proceed. I believe we all understand Dell, MJ, and MJ, right?
Yes, I understand. No question for me.
No question.
Okay, so the main thing for today's class is middlewares, right? Middlewares, and you might be wondering what a middleware is. Okay, there are certain situations in which you may need to execute something, right? Execute a function when a request hits your server, right? When a request hits your server and when a response is being returned, there are certain situations in which you may want to execute a function, all right? And that is where you make use of middlewares, all right? So this middleware is the function that you set up to be executed when a request comes into your server, and also when a request is returned from your server. There are certain applications, right? There are certain instances where you may need to do this. An example is for maybe database connections, right? You want to ensure that you have a valid database connection, all right, when the request comes to your server. That's for production app in which you are working with databases. And also, we have another instance in which we are going to demonstrate in this class, and that is timing the requests, right? Maybe you want to see how fast your server responds. You want to log the response times, okay? So you can make use of middlewares in this case, all right? When the request comes to your server, you pick the time this request comes in, and when the response is sent back, you pick the time as well, and then compute the difference between this time. So that is exactly what we'll be doing here. And we'll be using that to demonstrate the application of a middleware. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to create a function that we will use for that. And I'll call this function timing.
We're not seeing the VS Code.
Oh, sorry. I believe you can see it now, right?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. So we are going to create a function that is going to act as a middleware that will be activated when a request comes to the server. All right, and we'll use the function to compute the response time, right? How long it took our server to respond to this request, and then log that response time to a request header, the response header, and send that back to the client. Right, so that's what we're going to do for. That's the application we are going to use and really understand how middlewares work. So I'm going to call this function maybe I should call it time. For now it takes nothing, and I want it to just pass. So I don't want it to do anything. For you to create a middleware, all right, you need to decorate the function, just like we are decorating a path with app.get, all right, and the path parameter. To create a middleware, you just have to create a function and decorate that function as a middleware, and this function will be executed as a middleware. So to do that, we will just create a decorator, and this is app.middleware, right? So that is app.middleware, and we want it to be executed when an HTTP request comes to this particular server. And this app.middleware takes two arguments. By default, it takes two arguments. The first argument is the request, and the second argument that it takes is called CallNext, and we will explain more when we get to that. So this is the first argument it takes. That's request, and it is of type, and it is of type request, actually, not request. Change that to request. So that's the first argument it takes, and the second argument it takes is CallNext. All right, so let me explain that. So this request is like the request object that comes to the server from the client is that request that we are that our function is taking as a first argument, and the function also takes another parameter, another argument that's called CallNext, and this CallNext is the path operation that this request was channeled to. In this case, if we had numerous path here, like we have, for now we have only the base path, that slash. If we had something else like else like items, Yeah, if you have something else like items, that connects to refer to this particular part. Right. So now the next thing we are going to do is we are going to lock the time. Don't forget, we want to check the time that it took our server to respond to this request, to process the request and prepare response, right? So to do that, we are going to pick the time that this request comes in, then process this response, and then pick the time that this response is ready. So to do that, to work with time, we need to import a Python package that is called time, right? So we then lock the start time. Our start time is going to be time.time. Time. All right, done. When you are done taking the time that this request comes in, we are going to then execute the connect. That's the function that this particular request was directed at. All right. So that is going to be response is equal to await connect, and we'll pass in the request object. So let me explain again. The first thing is to get the start time, all right, the time that this request comes in. And when we get the start time, we then execute the function, the path that this particular request was directed at, all right, and pass in that request parameter to it. Then store the response in this response object. Now, the next thing we are going to do is to get the difference in time. All right. So let's say time difference will be equal to the current time times the time. Then we are going to subtract the current time from the start time. And the last step is to modify the response object. All right, add a header to the response object, and this header will contain the final time. That's this time difference, and then return this reference. So we will have the response.headers is equal to, okay, we want to create a new header instead of overriding all the headers. Then I'm going to call this X process time, and this will be equal to a stringified section of our time difference. Then the last step is to simply return this response. All right, so let me go through our middleware again. So what it does is first, it's okay. Don't forget, like I told you, this middleware is configured to intercept every request that comes to the server. All right, every request that comes to any endpoint in the server. So it picks the time that this request comes in, and it then forwards this request to the path. That's at line 10. It forwards this request to the specific path parameter that this request is meant for. All right. Now, when the response comes in, it then takes the time difference. The time this response comes in minus the time that the initial request came in. All right. It will pick this time difference. Then it will create a new header. That's at line 4. At line 12, I mean, it will create a new header called X process time. And this header will be equal to our time difference. Then it will return this response back to the client. So let us test this in case we have any errors. Okay, we'll test this with VS Code and see what happens. Okay, we still have hello world, and as you can see, oh, sorry, I didn't share my screen. Okay, I believe you can now see my request line. So if we send that request again, yeah, we still have the hello world, all right, but if you see the header, all right, the header after content type application.json, we have X process time. That's the request header, the response header that we attached to our server. Please don't forget, I think it is at line 12. At line 12, we edited our response header and attached X process time. We equated it to this time difference that we calculated at line 11. So that is exactly what we are having here on our request client. And from here, we have that this request took 0.001259 seconds to execute. So I would love to pause here for questions. Do we have any questions?
That line 10, can you explain it again? That line 10, because that await, what does it do?
Okay. So line 10, don't forget I told you that this time it takes in two arguments. Right? The first argument is the request object that is coming into the server, and the second argument is called call next. Right? And this call next is basically the path that this request was initially sent to. All right, and you know this is something that Fast API does under the hood. Something that Fast API constructs under the hood, and it is an asynchronous function. All right, so you cannot call an asynchronous function like a normal function like this. It will throw an error. It will not work. So you need to actually await an asynchronous function. That is why we are awaiting it. So we call that function and then pass in this request object that we got. All right. So it is at that line then that the path that we wanted to work with is executed. Right, it is at that particular line that path is executed, and at line 11 we take the difference in time. How much time did it take for that particular distance to execute, and compute the difference, and then return it to the front end. Please, have I answered the question?
Yes.
Okay. Please, do we have any other question?
So this middleware, does it applies to any other endpoint you create, right? So if you okay.
Yes, so let us experiment with these items endpoints to see if it applies to any other endpoints. All right, so this is items endpoint. I want to simulate a delay at this endpoint. Let us say it is processing a very expensive computation. Let's just print processing. So we are simulating an expensive processing on our server, and an expensive process normally takes time, and so I will sleep this server at this point. I want it to sleep for 5 seconds. Okay, should be after processing. So I want this to sleep for 5 seconds. All right. What this basically means is that the request will take some time. All right. When it executes line 23. That's processing. It will then wait without doing anything. It will wait for 5 seconds before it returns the result. That's detailed hello world. So let us test that endpoint and see if this request middleware, if this middleware is also attached. Let's go to our test command and test it out. Right, the endpoint is items, I believe. Let me confirm. Yes, items. All right, so let's see what happens. Okay, we now have a response, and let us see. Yeah, can you see this X process time here?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah, we have that request to 5 seconds 0.1359 blah, 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 blah. So when you specify a middleware, it applies to every single endpoint that you have on that particular project. Right? It applies to every single endpoint that you have. For example, in big projects, we are not going to use only a single file that we're using here. Like when we get to our project section, you see how big projects are normally structured. All right, you have different files. All right, you like different files and different endpoints, right? And having this middleware executes this code for every single request that comes to each and every single endpoint. Okay, please. Do we have any questions? Any sure? I think you just joined us, right? Do you have any question? Is the middleware, I believe what it means is that if the middleware is only useful in calculating the number of seconds that the request and response cycle took, no, there are other things that you can do with middleware. All right. I'm only using this particular example. Yeah, I'm only using this particular example to demonstrate it, like how it works, how you create the middleware, how you decorate the middleware and every other thing. Basically, you can use the middleware to execute any piece of code that you want to execute for whenever a request touches your server. All right, you can use it to maybe perform a database connection. You can use it to maybe check for something in the request, right? Is it a valid request? Like you can use it to do, the possibilities are endless. It doesn't really have to be the time difference checks. The possibilities are endless. You can run any code you wish to run. Let's say I just want to, maybe let's just say I want to print hello world, right? I just want to print hello world. All right, I can do that. I can do that. It doesn't really stop out. So in response to your question, MJ, you use it to just run any single code you wish to run. like when the request touches your server.
Okay, sorry, I have two more questions just quickly.
Okay.
The middleware is there, will there be a reason, since it applies to all endpoints, can there be maybe a reason where you want it to only apply to one or a few specific endpoints? Is there a kind of use case for that, or is it just meant to apply to every endpoint?
Okay, there is no use case for that. All right. When we are talking about middlewares, at this specific version of Fast API, you cannot configure the middleware to execute only for a certain endpoint. But if you want to execute a code for a specific endpoint or for a specific list of endpoints, you are going to use a dependency, and that is the next topic that we are going to look at in this particular class. After middleware. All right, so a dependency basically works the same way as a middleware, they're a little bit different. You use it to execute arbitrary code for any endpoint you wish to. Let's say it's mostly used for authentication. All right, let's say you want to confirm that the request that is coming to your server has the authentication token and that the authentication token is correct. We basically use a dependency for that, because when you have an API, it's not every single API that will be authenticated. Now, what I mean, you can have an endpoint that doesn't need authentication. Users can interact with this endpoint without authentication, and some endpoints will need authentication. An example will be an e-commerce app. If you want to create an e-commerce app in which people can make orders without having to sign up, all right, let's say I can come to the website, check out the products that you have, and then just click create an order. All right, create an order. Then if I wish to, I can then sign up and then have my account, view all the orders I've made, etc., etc. In that case, we use dependencies because there are certain endpoints that will require authentication, while other endpoints don't require authentication. But if there's a code you want to run universally across all the endpoints, you use a middleware for that. Though you can still use a dependency for it, but most times you use a middleware for it.
Okay.
Okay, so please, what's your other question?
Okay, this middleware, if I understand correctly, you can create multiple middleware, right?
Yes,
not
yes,
just one.
Definitely. Yeah.
All right. All right, that's all.
Okay, that's okay. Please, do you have any other question before we proceed? Okay, Henshaw, do you have a question? Okay, is HTTP the only parameter to be accepted? Wow. I am not 100% sure of this. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe this particular middleware is activated when the HTTP request comes to the server. I think it should be possible to decorate middleware for WebSockets, but I am not sure. So I'll make a research on that. I'll look at the documentation and check that out. My findings, what do I find out? I'll let you know by tomorrow. I'll let the class know by tomorrow. Okay, so that is perfect. Right. Now let's move to something else. So in addition to creating middlewares manually, all right, Fast API comes with a set of middlewares that you can just attached to your application, and that you can just attach your application and work with that. All right. And there are certain situations in which you may want to do that. The first one we are going to look at is the trusted host middleware, and you use this to check the host, like where this request is coming from. Okay, is it an allowed host? And if it is not an allowed host, you can then go ahead to reject that request. And let's look at that. Let's look at how that is done. We are going to import that middleware from first API. Good. So this is the middleware that is used to do exactly that. And to actually add a middleware that has already been created for you. For now, let me delete this. So actually add a middleware that has actually been created for you, you simply use the add middleware function. We use this add middleware, and you specify the middleware you want to add. And in this case, it is trusted host middleware. Trusted host middleware. And another thing you need to specify is what are your allowed hosts? What hosts do you want to allow? So let us say I want to allow only requests from a particular endpoint to hit my server. Let's say I want to allow requests only from, sorry about that. Let's say I only want requests from example.com. All right, so any request that comes from a domain that is outside example.com will be rejected in this case. All right, so do you really understand what we have here? Let me recap. Let me go through it again. In addition to, I shouldn't have deleted the other example. Let me keep it there for reference purposes. Sorry about that. Let me just keep it there for reference purposes. Okay, so if you want to add a middleware, all right, a middleware that you had already created, or an inbuilt middleware like this trusted host middleware, you use the add middleware class. Okay, use the add middleware method or function, not this one we used before, app.middleware. Like, so you simply do that, and you pass in the specific middleware you want to work with, and then pass in whichever parameter is required. Like in this trusted host middleware, we need to pass in the allowed host. Like, what host do you want to accept requests from? So with this, the request from my client should be rejected because it is not allowed. But let us see if that's true. Here, bad request, invalid hosted. All right. So this request has been rejected because it is not allowed. All right. It is the origin I'm sending from is not among the allowed origins, the allowed hosts. All right. So what you are seeing here is example.com. So if this is a live server that is hosted on the internet, it would only accept requests from a domain that is example.com, right? But if we have something like maybe KodeCamp.org, all right, this particular API would only accept requests from KodeCamp.org, right? Then we have a wildcard here. This
Yes, good.
okay. Sorry. So we have a wildcard here. When you pass in, fancy the star instead of any
Yes.
domain, yes, fancy the star. So this star means that you can accept requests from every single domain. Right. So if you use this, the endpoint will be executed. Right. All right, so in this case, the endpoint has been executed because we used that wildcard, meaning like request from every single region is accepted. And also, like you had asked earlier, it's perfectly possible to chain multiple middlewares. Like in our example here, we've combined both the trusted host middleware and our add process time header. So the whole thing. All right, please. Any question on that before we move to dependencies?
Okay, for the middleware, since they can be changed, is there any sort of like maybe priority, maybe like an order in which they are executed, maybe from top to bottom? Does it matter which middleware is on top? For example, if you take this app.add middleware and put it on top of the first middleware created, does it change it?
Okay. For this, though it is not explicitly written in the documentation, but during my personal test, I found out that the one lower is usually executed first. The one lower is executed first. For example, we have this add process time header before before trusted host middleware. So this trusted host middleware is executed before the add process time header middleware. So to test that in your own free time, here's what you should do. You can go to the advanced section of this fast API docs, and you see a whole lot of middlewares. We have HTTP redirect middleware, and it is used to it throws an error when the request that is coming to your HTTP server is not encrypted. Like if it is not HTTPS, it will throw an error. All right. So maybe you can add that particular middleware, then also add this other middleware, then check. All right, check which one will be executed first. Normally, the one that is down is executed. That's the one that is high up in priority.
All right.
Okay. So I believe you understand this, right? Before we proceed to, let me check the chat. Okay, no questions for me. That's good to know. All right, so I am going to push this to GitHub. Then we are going to create another file for dependencies. I want to do it now so that I don't end up forgetting. All right, so the updated code is on GitHub. When you are free, you can go and take a look at it. Now let's move to dependencies. I'll create a new file for that. Then I'll call this file server 2.5. I'll call that server 2.5. All right. So we are going to create a normal, we are going to create a fast API project as normal. And we are going to use it to better see, better understand what dependencies are in fast API.
You know, use touch to create the file.
Yes, I didn't. Okay, so I don't want to operate it. Okay, so we now have the file. We are going to, as usual, we are going to import the fast API class from fast API. Then we are going to make use of typing. We are going to make use of the optional function from typing. Import optional. Like I explained in the last couple of classes, this typing is used to declare any parameter, whether it's a path parameter, a query parameter, or a body parameter as optional. I mean, this optional we imported from typing. But if you're using Python 3.10 and above, all right, you don't need to use it. I'm only using this for users that are using Python from Python 6, from Python 6 up. We may have users that are not using Python 3.10, like you can see on screen. I'm using Python 3.1.0. So if I'm using the other syntax, it may work on my PC and then fail on your PC. So that's why we're using this particular one. But either way, I'm going to show you how to actually make parameters optional without using this optional class from type. For now, we've imported fast API. We need one thing, and it's called depends. All right, so this depends is as you can see, a function that makes it possible for us to create dependencies in fast API. And you may wonder, like, what are dependencies? All right, what really are dependencies? I believe you've heard this word before, like from your normal programming understanding. What do you really understand by dependencies before we get to the fast API application bit?
Okay, dependencies, I think it's like let's say in the area of software, like maybe a software that like a software that depends on another software or something like that. Maybe a software that depends on a file or a file, something like that. That's what I understand.
Yes, yes, perfect. There is no better explanation than that. Right. Take for example, this project that we are working on. Let me go back to my bash line. So take for example this project that we are working on. I told you like when we are installing fast API with a pip install fast API, then I passed in this for, and I told you that it installs all the dependencies of fast API. Right. Now when we say dependencies in software development, we're referring to like the pieces of code that what you're working on depends, right? You know how you can depend on something, all right? It needs these pieces of code to function, right? That's what we call dependencies. So in this case, sorry, I'm activating my virtual environment. All right, so in this case, these are the dependencies. You get Python dependencies with pip freeze. Yeah, so these are the dependencies that we need to actually run this project. We have to know this. The fast API is somewhere here. Yeah, fast API is somewhere here. We have Ginger 2, it's dangerous, Python, Pedantic, and etc. So these are dependencies for this project. Right, so just as projects have dependencies, the project we're working on has dependencies. It is also possible for your endpoint to have dependencies, right? Things that it depends on to function, things that it needs to function. So that's why the concept of dependencies in fast API actually came about. So this is very useful in situations in which you don't want to repeat a whole lot of code. You have shared logic. There is logic that is used in a whole lot of endpoints. Let's say you have a project, a very huge project that has maybe 200, 300 endpoints, and the shared logic across. All right, it won't really make sense to manually copy and paste this, copy and paste this, copy and paste this. Like it will break the basic like core of Python. You shouldn't repeat too much, right? If you are repeating yourself, you should just copy whatever you are repeating to a separate place and then link it from there. So that's where dependencies comes in. And we are going to look at it now, but this is not really the use case in real life projects. All right. In real life projects, we don't usually work like primarily handle path and query parameters using dependencies. It's mostly used for authentication and for security related applications, right? Things like to ensure that the request coming in there is properly authenticated, it has the right auth token attached to it, that the user performing a particular operation has the right permissions to do that, etc., etc. That's where we mostly use dependencies. All right, but we are going to use a very simple example to better understand how it really works. Right? It's just to help you understand how it really works. So that's it. So before we proceed, do we have any questions?
No question from me.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let us proceed. As usual, the very first thing we need to do, like every fast API project, we need to instantiate the class that we want to. We need to instantiate the fast API class, And since it is repeated code, I will just copy and paste here. Then the next step is to create the endpoint. The next step is to create the endpoint. And I'll create a very simple endpoint, like very, very simple endpoint that will accept, it will accept two query parameters, right? The endpoint will accept just two simple query parameters, nothing much, nothing serious. Two simple query parameters, and we'll expand from there. So we will decorate a get request, get endpoint, and I want this to, let that be the base endpoint. Then I'll create it should just return. Okay, for now, let me use pass. I believe you know what pass does in Python, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you don't want to do anything, like you want the Python interpreter to like skip that control flow, you use pass. For example, if we have something like maybe if true, maybe instead of writing code down here, you can just use maybe pass to skip that control flow, which is something. So this endpoint is going to accept just two query parameters. So take a screen that's called Q, and it is also going to accept the last query. Okay, let me just call this R instead. So second, I want this to be an optional. So I want this to be an optional parameter. And whenever it is provided, it should be a string. If it's not provided, it should just give me one. Then let's make this Q optional as well. And if it is not provided, it should return a null. So then I want to return this to. I want to return. I want to return Q and R. So let it be simple for now. Let it be simple for now. So let us start this server and see what happens. So let's test this and see what happens. All right, so it returns we don't have Q and we don't have R. That's why we get non. So let us attach that Q and R and see what happens. Okay. So now we have been able to capture the Q and the R query parameters. So how about situations in which maybe we had a whole lot of endpoints, like so many endpoints, like we have home that captures the same Q and R. Then we have another endpoint, and let's call this items that does the same thing, right? It still captures Q and R. And assume we have so many other endpoints that captures just Q and R. It doesn't really make sense to keep repeating this, all right? So keep repeating this Q and R, Q and R, Q and R. It doesn't make sense at all, right? So we can just abstract this. Take this capture logic to somewhere else and then link it to our part. That is where this depends comes in. Okay, so we are going to modify that function we have there. We're going to modify that function we have there, and we'll take it off that path to somewhere else and then link it down. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a new function, and I'll call this query depends. You can call it anything, of course. Query depends, of course, takes Q and R. Good. So it simply returns this. Very good. So now the question is, how do we get this from our base directory? All right, that is where the depends comes in. So we are going to call this query. We're going to define another parameter. We'll call this query, and this query is equal to depends. This depends are imported here, and what is it depending on? All right, I want it to depend on this query depends. Now we have received the return value. Oh, sorry, this will return here. So with this, we have received the return value of this Q, R, and R. All right, because this depends query depends like stored whatever return value it had on the query. All right, so from this function, from our home function, from our home directory, we can then work with this query that we have received from query depends. So in this case, I don't want to run any computation on the query. I just want to return that to client. So I can run I can define a simple return statement there to return that. Now let's test this and see what happens. If it will still work. All right, so if we send this request, as you can see, it still returns what we expected it to return.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so do we have any question on that? Yes.
Okay, please go back to the VS Code.
Let me switch. Yeah, I'm trying to do that now. Do you have a question on that?
Okay,
So we
so
can do the same thing here on the items endpoint. Instead of receiving this Q and R again, we just copy that, the reference to query depends down there, and return the query. Okay. Sorry. So we simply return the query. And that should work as well. Query items. Items sender. Yeah, it works as well. All right. So this, let me pause here for questions before we go into more advanced part of this. Any questions?
Okay, this is understood by me. I understand this.
Okay. I've not heard anything from Henshaw and MJ. MJ and Henshaw. Any question?
Check the chat.
Okay. No questions, okay. MJ, any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Sorry. No questions. Okay. That's it. So that's just it for dependencies. All right. So when we are the main use case for dependency is not what we are doing here. All right. What I'm doing here is just to demonstrate the concept of how you actually work with dependency. But in practice, you're not going to do this, right? Most of the times we use dependencies to handle authentication and permission related tasks. Right? The code that we use for authentication, we store it within a dependency like this, and then take it to whichever endpoint you want to put on. Let's say we have an endpoint that maybe we want only an authenticated user to have the capability to interact with that endpoint. Right? And take this dependency to the endpoints that we want that to run. Then if we have some resources that even if a user is authenticated, we want certain classes of users to access this resource. All right, we do that with dependencies as well. Most times you won't just be receiving and returning query parameters and pipe parameters and like that. But this is a very simple example that gives you the opportunity to really understand what it is all about. So we are going to look at another situation. It is entirely possible for you to chain dependencies. All right, you can actually chain dependencies. Okay, like we're going to do that now. Like now, we have one dependency that is called query depends. All right. Now we want to create another dependency that it depends on. Okay, it depends on another dependency, and then see what happens. So we are going to remove this queue to somewhere else. Let us call this other function queue depends. And we want to get a queue. So instead of then it should just return that queue. Now, instead of defining this queue optional string is about here, we can just define queue, which is of type string that depends, like they depend without that we have here. put it down there, that depends on this queue depend. All right, that depends on this queue depend. So this queue is not exactly extracted from the path. In this queue, query depends, we get that queue from queue depends. So in this case, we are chaining dependencies, right? You can chain dependencies for as long as you wish, like even if it's 100 to 100. There's no, it's perfectly allowed. The only thing is that it may, your app may drop a little bit in performance, but it's perfectly allowed if you have a perfect use case for it. So let us test this and see if it works. Okay, so as you can see, we've still been able to get the Q and the R. Do we have any question on that? The dependency chain.
So that means since dependencies can be made like you can choose the endpoint that takes the dependency, it means that if you have, let's say, like 5 dependencies, you can maybe, let's say, from A to A, let's say A, B, C, D, E dependency. So maybe one endpoint can be using A and B, another endpoint can be using B and D, another endpoint can be using E, it can be mixed. There's just depending, right? You can select any dependency for any endpoint.
Yes, definitely. You can use multiple dependencies for one endpoint. All right, you can do that if you choose to, and you can mix it anyhow you want.
All right, so.
Yeah, but I hope you understand the syntax.
Yes.
Okay. So I believe there's no other question. Do you have any question from the other members of the class concerning this?
Okay, so far, this, like all the dependencies you have created, use str equal to depend. So must it always be str? Can it be int or any other data type?
Yes, definitely. It can be anything. Like it can be an int. It can be just anything. It doesn't have to be a string. This str is the short form for string in Python. You are basically defining that. You're basically specifying that you are expecting a string type. When we say strings, for example, let me shut down the server. We have test is equal to vanilla. Yeah, so this is a string, right? Anything that is in between two quotation marks is a string. Then if you have something like test2 is equal to 7, this is an int. Then when something is a float, then anything that's maybe true or false is a bool. That's a boolean value. Then we have lists like this. It's called arrays in JavaScript. Then we have dictionaries. I think they're called objects in JavaScript. So it can accept anything. It doesn't have to be just a string. You can work with anything actually. Okay. So let us go to something else. There are certain situations in which you may okay, like you specified, right? What if we want to use multiple dependencies on one endpoint, right? You can choose to follow this new method, okay? But there are certain situations in which you may need to maybe work with a dependency that does not really return any value. It doesn't really do anything, right? Or maybe the value that it returns is not useful for you in the part that you are working with. Okay, so in those cases, you can use this method, this next method that we are going to work on. Before I do that, let me commit the current changes we have to our GitHub repo and then proceed to the next one. All right, so we are going to create a new file, that's server 3. For the server 3. Then, oops, sorry, server 3.5. I'm going to copy some of the code we had down. So let us create one endpoint, right? So I want to do something a little bit similar to what I've been saying before, that you really use dependencies for security related applications, right? So I want to do something like that here. We are going to create a new endpoint. I may as well copy the endpoints we have here. Okay, let me copy this down. I want an items endpoint, then I don't want this time to sleep. It's unnecessary for our purposes. So I want to create two dependencies. I want one to verify a token. One will verify a token and the other will verify a secret key. So the verify token will accept an X token header, which should be string of type header. For now, I'll pass. Of course, we need to import header from first here. So that's the first dependency we are going to work with. And I want to mimic a situation in which we want an endpoint that verifies that each request contains a certain header, a certain security information in the headers, the request headers. Then the next dependency will verify secret key. And the secret key is going to receive next key, which is a string, and is still going to get it from the header. And for now, you shouldn't do anything with it. I want it to just pass. So I want to modify these items endpoints to take in these two dependencies, right? So this particular endpoint will check that the user has a valid token and also the user has a valid secret key. So that's what we're going to do now. So when this is validated correctly, you can then return maybe this valid string. So we do that with this app dot get push put delete parameter. It takes something else. All right, it takes something else, and it is called dependencies. You know, if you highlight with your VS Code, you highlight on it with your VS Code, you will see this. I see what I've highlighted. Hello, can you all see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen, sir.
Yeah, VS
Okay.
Code, yeah.
Okay. So you can see these dependencies are highlighted, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if you highlight, if you hover over the get or maybe put or anything, you will see some things. All right. These are the parameters that you can pass to the get function over there, the get decorator over there. And one of them is dependencies. All right. You can pass in a list of dependencies there. And this, oops, I didn't copy that. Dependencies is equal to, so this takes a list of dependencies that you want to be activated when this particular parameter, when this particular endpoint is called. So we are going to pass in the first dependency, which will be depends on verify token. Then I also want this endpoint to depend on secret key. All right. So this is basically the syntax. Okay, this is basically the syntax. If you want multiple dependencies to execute on one endpoint, you can do something like this. So this will first check that the token is valid, and if the token is valid, you then go on to check that the secret key is also valid. All right, and if they are all valid, the whole thing will go through. Like if no error is raised at your dependency function, the whole thing will go through. So we can then check maybe if the X token, if this X token we've received is not equal to a certain parameter, I want a certain error to be raised. Let's say if not, it's not equal to maybe test token. I want to raise an error. And in the last class, we looked at HTTP exceptions. So we are going to make use of that here. I want to raise an HTTP exception. And the status code should be, it should be a 422 error. And I want the detail to be, wrong token. All right, then we are going to do the same thing here with the secret key. If the secret key is not equal to what I'm expecting, I want it to raise an error. If X key is not what we're expecting, I want it to, of course, raise an error, trunking. And most of the times when you are working with authentication related tasks, authentication errors always return a 401 or a 403. So a 422 is for malformed request. So we're going to use a 401. Now let's test this if it works. And get a chance to debug. 03. Reload. So let me switch back to my request client and let's see what happens. Okay, items. So it's supposed to take X key and then X key and X token. So let me first send this wrong key first. X token. Wrong. Wrong. So we should get an error here. We should get an error here. Which did not wrong. Why is that so? Okay, we don't have the best endpoint. What we have is items endpoint. All right, so we have for one, that's wrong token. Let me go back to my VS Code, please. So as you can see at line 9, all right, so okay, first at line 18, when request comes to items, the first dependency is executed, all right, verified token. So it then takes it then extracts that token, that X token header, right, and then compares. Like if this token header is not equal to a string called test token, it should return a 401 error with the detail of wrong token. That's line 9 and line 10. Then at line 13, it then executes the second dependency, which was specified at line 18. Depends secret key. So it extracts the X key header and then checks if the value of that header is not equal to test key. It returns a 401 error and gives a detail that this particular key is a wrong key. So that's exactly what we are having here. Then if the key and the token is what we expect to receive, it will then return, it will then execute that part and return what we expect to receive, which is an invalid key and a Boolean value. So let us run the test again and see what happens. So now token, let's change it to test token. Test token. Is that what we're expecting? Yeah. this token. Let's see what happens. It should give us a different error. Yes, it should give us a different error that we have the wrong key. So now let us correct that key to what we expect to get. Key. Test key. With this, we should get the value that we should get if that part is executed successfully, which is valid is equal to true. So now let me go through this again. All right. You can actually define an endpoint that accepts more than one dependencies. All right. In the last example, we defined an endpoint that accepted only one dependency, but in this case, we wanted it more than one. All right. So to do that, we use this dependencies arguments. It is a key parameter. If you hover over your request type, all right, you will see that dependencies is one of the accepted arguments, right? And it accepts a list of dependencies that you want to execute, that you want to run for this specific endpoint. Okay, so in this case, we specified one dependency that checks the token, that checks the header, to ensure that the header comes with an X token. Right? Then we also have another dependency that checks that our secret key is correct. All right. So if the token is incorrect, it will then raise a HTTP exception that we have the wrong token. And if our key is incorrect, it also raises a HTTP exception that our key is incorrect. So basically, this is how you define multiple dependencies, right, for a particular endpoint. And this is usually the common use case for dependencies. It's usually used for authentication related tasks, right? Not the other example we did in the last part. So please, do you have any questions? Any question? Any questions so far, please?
These dependencies now, we can also use it to verify login and user login or sign-on details.
Yes, definitely. So how this works is that when a user logs in, right, on a normal server, on production grade server, you issue tokens, like shareability tokens. You encode these tokens and then return it to the user. So the client, for each subsequent request, okay, let's use Facebook for example. All right, so when you go to Facebook to log in, what really happens under the hood is that the server takes your username and password. It then goes in there to run computations to ensure that the username is correct and the password is correct. And if what is supplied is correct, a token, a JWT token, is generated, signed on the server, and then sent back to a client. That's your mobile app or the Facebook website that you accessed, that you performed the authentication with. So these clients will then store this token. But of course, this token has an expiry date. It could be 1 day, it could be 2 days, I'm not sure. It has an expiry date. So the client will then store these tokens and then attach these tokens to every single request that it makes to the Facebook server. So that's really how it works. Then when this request gets to, for each endpoint that you're working with, let's say you're uploading a picture, right? That's an endpoint. You are changing you're uploading a post, you are sending a message, those are endpoints on your own. So before this thing is, before the request is successful, the server then checks, the server has to check that header if the token you supplied is actually correct. All right, if it is a valid token, the request is allowed to proceed. And if it is not a valid token, the request is rejected. So these are situations in which dependencies are used because they are, take Facebook, for example, they have so many, I wouldn't say they have millions of endpoints, but a whole lot of endpoints, right? So it doesn't really make sense to build the authentication logic for every single endpoint. It would be too cumbersome, actually. So it makes a whole lot of sense to bundle everything into dependency and then put this in the specific endpoints that we need to put in. So that's just it. Please, do you have any other questions? Please, any question? Ensure, MJ, and Uche. Are you still there? All right. So I believe the absence of question means that we all understand. All right. So it's almost 3. So we are done for today's class. Tomorrow's class will be all about authentication. Right. We are going to work with, we are going to look at security, permissions, working with JWT tokens. I've been talking about JWT tokens. How does it work? Like, what do you use it for? How do you use it? So that's what we are going to, work with in the next class. That's tomorrow's class. So until then, if you have any question, if you have any suggestion, please, reach out to me on Slack, and I'll be very, very happy to attend to it. So I guess we will end it at this point. So thanks all for attending. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. So.
All right, you're welcome. Right, you're free to drop off. Class is over. Thank you.